Hi, I'm Pastor Andrew Core. I'm here today with Dr. Jeff Barker, and we're going to talk about our experiences with being bivocational and some of the challenges that come along with that. Today, we're going to talk about dealing with the reality of bivocationalism and what's been going on, especially in our context, our denomination. And it's great to have Jeff on the show with us today. Before we get started, let's go ahead and pray. Dear God, I thank you for this wonderful day, and I thank you for this opportunity that we get to come together and talk about these issues. And Lord, I pray that your voice will be heard in the midst of this conversation. We pray these things in your name. Amen.
Amen.
So, bivocational is one of those words, right? And to give everybody a little context, Jeff was my pastoral mentor in college, and he was one of my professors at ENC. And this is a word that came up a lot, right? I think almost exclusively from you. I don't think I heard really from any of our other professors about bivocationalism. But this word came up a lot, and it's a pretty constant reality in most places I know of. On our district here, North Central Ohio, we have 22 pastors that are bivocational. Jeff's in Metro District, right?
Right. Yeah.
And you're at 50 to 75%.
Oh, yeah.
Easily.
Yeah.
So, just to give you a little context of where we're coming from with some of these things and just the reality of what bivocationalism looks like. So, the first question I want to ask you, though, is when you talk about the challenges of being bivocational, what do you think is probably the biggest hurdle that we come to in terms of being pastors and being bivocational?
Thanks, Andrew. It's good to be with you today and to really revisit these conversations that you and I have had for a number of years now, right? Certainly going back to our time together as in an earlier stage of life. And so I think as I've been watching some of your videos and whatnot, there are a number of things that come into play here, right? That some of the challenges that come with that certainly are the economic realities, right? That drive many of us and many congregations to this model of ministry. And I'll be honest with you, I think it's going to be a permanent fixture on the landscape. I think it's a ministry model that we've got to continue to refine and think through and ground it theologically, biblically as we navigate all of this time together. So certainly I think people will talk about time management, right? How do you navigate all of this if you're working 40 hours a week and then you've got life in the church, you've got a family, you've got, right? How do you navigate all of that since we all have 168 hours in the week? Nobody gets any more, no one gets any less. And how do we navigate that? So time management, finances, family life, what does that look like? Vacation time, do we spend vacation time doing church functions, and how does that then play itself out in our ongoing burnout and fatigue that can set in? But as I kind of cluster all of those, I think that what we forget is that what I think maybe the largest challenge is communication, or I'll call it relational communication or relationship communication. And I'm going to ground that in the relationship between the pastor and the congregation, right? And that we often think of the bivocational pastor as someone over here who's trying to figure out their personal family finances, time management by themselves. And in doing so, they're resolving some of the economic underfunding from the church, right? So they're really shouldering both of those responsibilities. And I can remember one pastor's spouse in some of my research that I did say that the congregation just has no idea the weight or the pressure or the sacrifice that is being made by the pastor and by extension by the pastor's family. And so that's where I want to center in on this notion of communication, right? What is the relationship between the congregation and the pastor in this? And the best way I can think about it is through the relationship of a marriage, right? And while this may not have all of the components that we would think about, I think it's a healthy image, metaphor to use in relationship, right? So if we can think about a marriage, and maybe they've been married 20 years, 25 years, somewhere in there, and their children are getting ready to go off to college and they need extra income. And so one spouse takes on a part-time job. Well, all of the things that spouse had been doing prior now get left unattended to, right? So maybe the spouse that is now going out to earn more income was the one who did the grocery shopping, is the one who maybe fixed dinner, is the one who got the kids to school on time, or whatever it may be. But with these new responsibilities, they're no longer able to do that. And if there's no communication, right, there's anger, perhaps even bitterness that can encroach in the other person's experience, because that person isn't doing what they always used to do. That's what I think is going on in a lot of our congregations with the pastor, right? The pastor is shouldering all of these extra responsibilities, solving all of the economic problems in their family and their congregation's life, using the image of they're burning the candle at both ends, right? They're moving toward burnout because they're trying to do everything. And what has happened is the one person in the relationship has made significant modifications, and the other side hasn't adjusted to those realities and may still even complain that this pastor isn't doing what the previous pastor did. This pastor isn't visiting enough, or this pastor isn't, right? But it's because they haven't communicated how that relationship has changed in light of these new realities for them. And so when I talk about communication or relational communication, that's really what I'm talking about. There has to be more transparent, honest communication going on between the pastor and the congregation relative to this new model of ministry. It's different than what it could be expected before. And so I think that's all at play here as we think about that. So challenges, courage for the pastor to say that these are the new realities, and perhaps humility from the congregation to say, oh, I didn't understand that, or I didn't see those modifications or those changes taking place.
I think you said some words that kind of resonate really heavily with me in every context that I've been in, and I'm going to venture to guess that every context that you've been in, you've heard someone inevitably say, well, the previous pastor didn't do it that way, or the previous pastor did this, and the one struggle I've been in, and I've been in, this is the first congregation that I've been in that has gone from a full-time pastor to, I'm the transitional pastor, Kirsten and I. We're now the bivocational in this context, and they've extended us a lot of grace, but that's a challenge in and of itself. Is that's the previous pastor used to do this. Well, I don't necessarily have the same skill set as that pastor, and I don't have certainly the time commitment that previous pastor did. So as we look further into like how we communicate, are there any steps that we could start taking as a denomination to help facilitate that conversation in a not only a more positive light, not to say that everything about bivocationalism is positive, but to frame the conversation in a way of like this, we need help. Like, where do we get to that point?
So this notion of communication, right? So I think it happens between pastor and congregation. And I think, as you've mentioned, it needs to happen denominationally, right? As a district or even as more broadly the U.S. context, as we're grappling with this reality as more and more common during this season of life. So first, I think we've got to ground it theologically, right? And in doing so, when we talk about kind of this unit of pastor and congregation, I think what it invites us to is to a recovery of the significance of the priesthood of believers, and that is the call of the church. And so the role of the life of the congregation is significant. And again, this is my analysis, and it's not universal per se, but I think we over the last 40 years have become far more clergy centric in our organization, in our reporting structures, that then demand more and more time from the pastor, or the pastor has to say something about every decision that's being made, or we organize it in this particular way. And to really recover the priesthood of believers. So I think that's grounded biblically and theologically as kind of a reclaiming of that. that then allows the pastor to not be doing everything, but perhaps to be cultivating relationships with the various parishioners and empowering them, educating them, training them, nurturing them, guiding them into deploy the gifts that they have as the people of God. So I think it happens at a local congregational level, but then I think we've got to have broader conversations about what are legitimate expectations for a pastor and a pastor's family that is not going to be fully funded by the local congregation, right? That's a title, that's a descriptive category, much as we call bivocational as a descriptive of that kind of pastor, right? That pastor is employed, has multiple revenue streams, whatever it may be. The congregation is not fully funded or able to sustain a full-time pastor. And so that means that they have to kind of barter and exchange different different kind of gifts, right? Of how do we navigate this relationship if it's not going to be a financial transaction that supports this? What is the bartering system we're setting up here to make this whole relational unit, like a marriage and family? How do we make it so that this whole relational unit thrives? So I think grounding it theologically, biblically, and then certainly working through that as a relational matrix continues to think, I think in our tradition, keeps relationship at the core of all of it.
That language, fully funded or non-fully funded, some people find I've been talking to a few people about. I've used those terms before, both stemming from our conversations and just the reality of the current situation. Some people find it a very bitter taste to hear those kind of words, and they're like, "What do you mean we're not fully funded?" Well, I think a lot of people highly underestimate the overhead that churches come with,
right?
The keeping the lights on. Just the basic amenities of keeping a church afloat and going. You'd be surprised. I mean, I think most people would if you go look at your local church budget and see like, oh, that's
right.
Weird. It paints an entirely different picture. And not to say that being fully funded or non-fully funded, one is better, they're different contexts. Right. However, as we're dealing with those different contexts, that obviously changes the role. I mean, as we've been talking about, that changes the role of pastor. And like, as we change that role and we redefine those boundaries, and as we're working through that method of making new language, do you think that there's going to be a time where that like we're going to have to drastically shift our thinking and our theology? Like, I know that we have the same kind of idea of what pastor is, and the manual has its own set of specifications as to what the pastor is and what the pastor's responsibilities are. How do we have that shift in the pastoral role without, while explaining to people like these are just the current reality?
Yeah, and I guess part of my introduction of using fully funded congregation and non-fully funded congregation was to match up with the descriptive categories that we were giving to pastors, right? So if it's understood as a relationship, and I use them as merely descriptive categories, right? They're not positive, they're not negative, they're value neutral, right? They don't carry any. They're just describing the context, right? Because those categories are not biblical, they're not theological, and so if we want to ground our ecclesiology biblically, we're going to need to use categories that are maybe much more similar and arise from the biblical narrative. So I hear you. I think people do put values, I mean, implicitly on church size, right? That we know that's part of all of it in naming reality. I guess I'm now at the point, I guess, having been some version of bivocational for at least 2 decades now, right? That I think the model is permanent for us, right? It's always going to be here for us. And while there may be places and contexts where some are fully funded and aren't required to work outside the church, that model of ministry is going to be less frequent than it has been. And yet my concern is those those models of ministry are the pronounced ones that shape denominational polity. So we can kind of put that on the side here of another conversation of who's shaping denominational polity and how we organize life in the church. My concern is it's not those who are living these other realities. It's one who has a kind of more of the historic fully funded congregational relationship between pastor and congregation, right? So they have more time, they can attend meetings during the day, whereas bivocational pastors may be working during the day and can't access those in that kind of way. So all of that to say, in the larger landscape, I think we've got some conversations that need to happen and some voices that we need to hear. And I'm comfortable. I should say I have grown to be more comfortable with this model of ministry, but it's got to be grounded in a recalibrating of the relationship between pastor and congregation, and that it has to be really developed through the lens of an ecclesiology shaped by the priesthood of believer. And so a phrase that I now use is the future of the church does not rest with a more efficient clergy, but a more fully engaged priesthood of believers, right? That's where the mission of the church is going to be embodied in communities and in relationships within our social context is through the vehicle of the priesthood of believers.
Yeah. All of this kind of talk, I mean, some of the challenges that people don't realize that bivocational pastors go through is that when you're bivocational, you are taking usually vacation time from your non-church job to go do church functions, right? Or you're taking paid time off, all that kind of stuff. You're having to navigate this this scheduling nightmare that comes with that. I mean, there's so many other problems that come along with it. The biggest one, I think, for a lot of pastors who are bivocational, and one of the things I've been hearing in a lot of the conversations that we've been having, both me and Jeff and all of the people that we've had and the ongoing conversations outside of these videos, is how is your context like equipping you for ministry? Like, how is your non-church job helping you? Like, are you taking a burden to that place? Is that place giving you a burden to bring back to the church? How are you dealing with the stress of those things? When we talk about the entirety of being bivocational, no one talks about that side of things. They just say this is just the reality, right? Like, oh, I have to, But thinking about, especially in light of, I've been reading Tim Brooks' book, and the Formational Power of Worship, and it has me thinking a lot recently, like, what am I doing in my non-church job that is, like, what's that identifier in my life that's making me bivocational? And how is that impacting the way I talk, the way I act, the way I present things? Is that, I know in your context, that's also something that you have to deal with, and especially in the context, for those of you who haven't heard Jeff speak before, his dad was a bivocational pastor, and just the context there, like, how do you work through that understanding of how this forms and informs your life?
There's right. It's a narrative, right? And with narratives come labels, right? It becomes our shorthand, our way of communicating ideas in all of this. And so I think there is, as we even mentioned earlier, right? There's this negative narrative about bivocational or non-fully funded, right? That it comes with that. And so as we go back, right, when you mentioned, right, what is coming home with us from the workplace, whatever it may be, I guess this gave me a new insight of, man, sometimes you have really bad days at work, right? I mean, you come home and you're just right. And I began to think about that. And I don't think I'd connected these things before, that when you bring that home from your work, right, your bivocation, your second vocation, whatever you want to call this over here, how that then already weighs heavy then on any work you need to do related to the church that evening, or reaching out to parishioners, whatever it may be. And if you're working, and again, I think there are so many different variables in this. Someone may be working 20 hours a week, someone may be working 30 hours a week, someone may be working another job 40 hours a week. And what does that 40 hours or 20 or 30 hours, how does that shape them, right? Certainly there could be some skills that they develop in all of that, but what is the relational context in which they find themselves, and what is the narrative that is shaping them in that particular location, right? Or do
Mm-hmm.
they have, much like they have a bivocation, right? Do they have a dual identity, right? Do they have to be someone different there because of the job specifications, or are they free to carry their pastoral identity with them? So I think that's what different people are going to be wrestling with that in different kinds of ways, right? So maybe there's more overlap for you, right, between what you're doing with hospice and some things of that nature, where you get to carry more of your pastoral identity with you. But there may
Yeah.
be other places where language of faith is left at the door, right? And you take on you assume this identity in a particular work environment that is certainly impacting you in that kind of way. And so I think those narratives that we live have to be attended to, right? So if there's a 40-hour a week story that I'm living, how is that being fed by the Christian story, my faith journey, and how it plays itself out? And do I and what is the value of good work, Andrew? The questions you're asking, there's so many spin-off questions
Yeah.
here that I think we keep wrestling with. That is somehow that work then more or less valuable than my pastoral life and work, right? That pastoral work is that to which I'm called, but in some ways I've given it a second class status because I've got to fund it in different kinds of ways. And so I think there's an internal wrestling that you work through in that shapes your identity. And then finally, I guess I'll kind of go back to this, that what I found in some of my research, more anecdotally than kind of using scientific method in any kind of way, was the number of pastors who just said that they refuse to use the label bivocational, even though it's a reality for them, because they have come to see that it is a value. It's a category that devalues them in the sight or the eyes of their colleagues, or at least they perceive it that way. And so, while we may have a large number of pastors who self-identify as bivocational, the number is going to be greater than that, because there are a number of them that won't self-identify in that way, because they sense that it devalues them as persons and
Yeah.
their vocational work as pastors.
Yeah. I definitely feel that, right? Like when you talk about you're talking about like bivocational. Well, if I'm bivocational, does that mean that I'm part time? Well,
Right.
no. That's a whole different conversation, and there are all of these questions that we have to work through, and I think they all bear weight answering. I find tremendous value in bivocational in bivocational living, right? Like having to be bivocational by proxy of whatever it is. However, not to say that it's always the funnest time in the world. There's been plenty of times where I come home and all I want to do is go lay down, and but that's not the reality. Like, I don't have that as a reality. And so when we work in these places, I have a lady at my church who just yesterday said to me, "Pastor, I pray for you every day that when you're out in the world, people are taking your words seriously." And I said,
Mm.
"Well, I hope they do," right? Like, because I'm
Yeah.
I'm speaking with families and with people who are actively dying, right? And they hear the words that I say, and I've had several people in my church who are like, "We're so grateful that you're being able to be this tool of ministry." And for the longest time, I mean, even in my secular job, before I worked in hospice and I was working in auto parts and all that kind of stuff, people at my church would still say to me, like, "We're just, Pastor, we're praying that you are a presence of Christ in their lives," and that really flipped the script for me personally, because before I was just like, "Oh, this is just a necessity," right? Like, I'm just doing this out of necessity, and I hadn't really considered it as part of my calling, but now that I'm doing it, it's definitely informed the way that I live life. and the way that I've changed. I don't know if that's been a similar reality for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe as you just framed it that way, right? Pastor, that I'm praying for you, however it
Yeah.
was said, and it flipped the script for you. In some ways, that's the same script that the parishioners need to be living too,
Yeah.
right? Right. And how do we see this as our witness in the world, right? How do we bear witness to who God is and what God is doing? To bring about the full redemption of all creation, right? That God is redeeming all things, and that we are participants in that, in our embodied existence, right? Our embodied life
Yeah.
here and now. But yeah, certainly that's. And I guess I will say this, Andrew. I'll be right. Right there's this. Well, on one hand, pastors will say Bible those who are working, like say, like you are, or elsewhere outside of kind of congregational life, to support themselves in some form or fashion. That will say, yeah, it's just good to be in the world with real people, right? I mean, it's good. And my question always is, well, what were you actually doing as a pastor in the first place? If you weren't, I mean, right? Did you not
Right.
have a strategy for engaging the people in your community? I mean, that's kind of one of those things that uh, I think we just need to reflect on a little bit more. Is to has does by default, and I'm not supporting this. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Does by default being employed or engaged outside the congregation's life for your sustenance in some form uh, keep you more uh, reduce the likelihood of disengagement from the community? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of putting this out there as a way of thinking that if pastors are struggling with engaging their community because they don't have a job outside the church, uh, maybe maybe we need to rethink uh,
Maybe
how we
how would do ministry?
yeah,
How would do church life?
right, you're right. I
Yeah.
mean, it's. I mean, I think it's an important question in the midst of all of these other questions to ask. Well, because I'm getting paid to do work, I'm in the community, but are you not volunteering your presence or your ministry in the
Yeah.
community in some kind of way? If you're not, so I'm not, again, not value say. I think it's forcing us to ask these questions and expose the assumptions and the tendencies that may be at play because we've built an institutional structure in a particular kind of way, that this new model of ministry, and I think there are variations of this in a lot of different ways. I think we can think about it in more than one way. I think we've got to have multiple models of ministry at play in our communities in light of all of these realities.
Yeah. You can't put all your
And,
eggs in one basket,
yeah,
especially in the midst of COVID.
yeah, and we just have to reflect on it theologically and practically as to what it ought to look like in this given context.
Yeah. One of the things that I really took from you as a professor when when I was at ENC and several of my other friends is we always found it funny. Jeff would have a new spiritual formation experiment going on in his own personal life, and he'd come and share it with us. I remember one year you'd stopped using like lights after a certain time, and you'd only use candles, and um, just things like that.
Yeah,
This is a horrible transition, but I wanted to ask you how, like, because you've been bivocational for almost 2 decades now, and it's just been a present part of your reality. You've had a lot of time to meditate on it and think about it and be disciplined in it. Um, and this is a question I think that we need to. This is always going to be a part of the conversation for me. Is how do you do self care? Like and this is a question I ask everybody because I want it to understand. Like I want people to understand. There's no right or wrong answer here, but you need to be able to take Sabbath and those kind of things. So how are you accomplishing that in your current context?
yeah. I think you've got to be purposeful about it, right? And that's maybe that's the kind of the baseline of my experimentation, right, with all of these different things. And at the same time, I recognize that my expression of kind of bivocational is different than other people's. Most of mine has been enough overlap between what I was getting paid for at church life that I could. It wasn't different arenas, right?
Right.
There was enough similarity that I wasn't too distracted from one to the other, and it was an easy pivot back and forth. So that made it a little easier for me to navigate some of that. Whereas I think I mentioned before to you that my dad was pastoring a church, but also working for a company that had nothing to do with the ecclesial life, right? I mean,
Right.
it was working in an office, management, whatever it was. That while there might be skill sets that were transferable, there wasn't content that was being delivered, developed there that he could use over here. And so I recognize that's been part of my, and maybe that gives me a little more positivity toward the model. But in terms of self care, I mean, and I don't know if you did this when you were a mentor at the church, pastoral mentor, or um, sometimes I made everyone do a time assessment, right? A weekly time assessment, right?
Yeah.
Right?
I did it at least 4 times.
Okay, right, right. Because we got to know how we're spending our time. No one gets any more, no one gets any less, right? We all get 168 hours. Right? I'm convinced that that's kind of at the heart of this, and maybe where I would expand it now is I would probably share it a little bit more with at least the church board, so that they had an understanding of what all of this is, right? So self care for me, Sabbath has become important. It's kind of foundational for me. Early on, my first congregation that I was serving, Stacy was working in her profession, which was a Monday to Friday, 40-hour week, and then certainly the kind of the upswing of ecclesial life would always build towards Sunday, right? That was always kind of, and when the girls were little, Saturday morning we could do some things, but then by Saturday afternoon I was distracted, right? I mean, maybe I was a vacant presence in the room because I was already thinking about things and transitioning to Sunday. So the short story is I kind of got to the point where we didn't have Sunday evening, and so noon on Sunday through Monday morning really became my Sabbath, right, where I kind of shut down, and that was a better space for me and for us as a family. And it then made for a healthier even transition into the work week, Monday to Friday for Stacy and for certainly the girls going back to school and whatnot. So Sabbath has always been part of that. Exercise for me, I realized about 10 years, 12 years into ministry that I was getting more and more unhealthy, not exercising. And it wasn't because I didn't want to, it was because that other things became more higher priority. And so I started registering for races and other things that forced me to train. And that then became a mechanism for me. And so praying, cycling, running, and swimming became primary vehicles for prayer. Swimming in a pool underwater became the best for me. It's so quiet. And the rhythm and cadence of all of that really became a period of prayer when I would engage in that. The candle, I still use that. I mean, I argue that our artificial lighting tells us that we have to be productive 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because we can turn the lights on and do that. And that before we had that, it was either daylight or candles, right? And you can only do so much with candles. And so I think that became the beginning of my. I would light a candle as the end of my day. I don't have to be productive. I'm not required. I'm not expected to be productive from this hour on until I get up in the morning. So that those are mechanism tools that I began to use as a way to put some boundaries on all of that. So that working 168 hours a week, if you work X, Y, or Z, and then you subtract all of that. And you want to make sure you're attending to your family, right? You're cooking meals, you're mowing the lawn, right? You're repairing the leaky faucet. You're going to the grocery store. All of these things have to be navigated, and part of all of that. And so again, I guess I would candle, right? Exercise, Sabbath, and a constant reviewing of your time assessment, right? Where are the hours being spent? And maybe going back to the very beginning of our conversation, and maybe it's because I'm older now, I have more confidence in my analysis and utilization of the hours that I have, that I would use it as representative to the congregation, and invite them into a similar kind of project, right? Where's Sabbath for them? What does that look like? But to help them, especially in a bivocational model of ministry, to understand that if you're working 20 or 30 hours outside, uh, that's just not free hour. You're not still
Right.
going to give all of that to the church because you've got to still sleep. You've got to attend to your family. You've got to do all of these other kinds of things. So, but I think being intentional and thinking about things that are life giving, that kind of allow you to work out your frustration, or your bitterness, your anger, whatever it may be. I journal a lot. That's part of it for me as well. And then I did a ritual before I moved to New York City where I went back and I burned. I had kind of a ceremony where I
A book
burned
burning
all
ceremony.
of these a book burning of all of these journals. And someone said to me, "Well, yeah, like Wesley, why didn't you keep all of those so that we could have them?" I said, "Well, because you're probably named in them, and I had to."
I wonder how many journals you burned through just on me and Brent. Just
I just, yeah, I had to burn them, right? I didn't want anybody to see any of that stuff. But I think coming up with strategies, and again, being purposeful and intentional with the use of your time, and then communicating with the church board in particular, maybe not the whole congregation, but increasing the communication between what is your experience,
mm,
and how they can be supportive, and maybe where they can hold you accountable, in some of those things as well.
awesome. Well, thanks for being on with us today. I really appreciate it.
Good, this is good.
Thank you guys for watching, and if you made it this far, we appreciate it, and we thank you for all that you've been in support for us. We'll talk to you next time. See you.